Chapter 1. Endings and Beginnings. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I saw, and behold a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given power over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. The Book of Revelation, chapter 6, verses 7 through 8. "Wake up, John! Wake up!" Laura yelled. I opened my eyes and sat up. I could see my wife Laura leaning over me, her face framed in her curly reddish-brown hair and her blue eyes wide with fear. I tried to wipe the sleep out of my eyes as I said, "What is it?" Laura, in a panicked voice, said, "There's something wrong with the neighbor. He's lying in the street. I think he's dead." She was shaking and pointing toward the stairs. I could see the fear in her eyes. This was serious. Tears were forming, and she motioned for me to hurry. Any lingering drowsiness that I had felt was gone and replaced by a rush of adrenaline. Okay, I'll check it out," I said. I quickly put on a pair of pants and pulled on a shirt. I still felt tired because I had gone to bed after 3 a.m. I had worked the swing shift as usual at the truck rental outfit where I am employed as a mechanic. I was still trying to orient myself as I stumbled around trying to find my other shoe. As I went down the stairs, I tripped over the rollerblade of one of my 7 kids, and then jammed my toe into the door jamb trying to catch my balance. "Ouch!" I exclaimed. Grumbling under my breath and cradling my bleeding foot, I hopped over to the window. When I peered into the street, I saw somebody lying in the street. What is going on? I limped to the door, having forgotten about the bleeding toe. There was definitely something wrong, I thought. That is the understatement of the year. I crossed the porch and descended the stairs onto the driveway. I paused, listening, wondering if there was danger that I needed to be aware of. My senses were heightened. Something was out of place even more than the man lying in the street. Something just felt off, wrong. By all accounts, it was a nice, warm July morning. However, the birds were not chirping, and no dogs were barking. No, they were replaced by more disturbing sounds. I could hear sirens in the distance. I could hear the volunteer firefighter alarm wailing, and I thought that I could hear distant popping sounds. Were those gunshots? As I looked down at the man in the street, any sounds that I had noticed were forced out of my consciousness. Was that man on the ground my neighbor Charles? Was he hurt? Dead? It was Charles. He was lying face up with one of his legs bent underneath him at an awkward angle. I ran toward him, yelling, "Charles, are you okay?" There was no response or movement. I looked at his now ashen face, and there was red foam oozing out of his mouth. His eyes were open, vacant. It was obvious that he was dead. What could cause this? He didn't deserve this. Our daughters are good friends. He's a nice guy who loves his family. Suddenly I heard movement and looked up. A little girl no more than 6 years old was stumbling toward me. That is Charles's daughter. Her face was turning blue, and the same bubbling foam was spilling out of her mouth. It oozed slowly down her chin and onto her dress. I could see terror in her eyes, and she was clawing at her throat. The whole front of her dress was covered with the red foam. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I could think of was that she needed to breathe. I ran to her and flipped her upside down and gently shook her up and down, hoping to clear her airway. The foam just kept coming out of her mouth in an oozing pile on the road. And then all of her muscles tensed up, and with a final spasm she went limp. I laid her down on the street and knelt next to her. I started chest compressions, but all I could hear was a gurgling sound deep in her lungs. I frantically tried to use my finger to get the red foam out of her mouth. but it just kept bubbling. I yelled, "Lizzie, stay with me!" There was no response. Then I switched back and forth between chest compressions and trying to clear her mouth with my finger. I don't know how long I worked on her, but finally, with my arms sore and a sheen of sweat on my face, I stopped. I could tell from her blank stare into the sky that she was gone. I felt a pang of guilt. I wanted to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but, God forgive me, I was afraid to try. I don't want that red foam in my mouth. My knees were throbbing because of kneeling so long on the asphalt. I sat back on my feet. For a minute, nothing seemed real. This must be a dream, a nightmare, I thought. It was one thing to find a dead man, but quite another to have a child die in your arms. I looked at her face, and as strange as it sounds, I thought, she looks peaceful now. She's not scared anymore. I was startled out of my morbid thoughts by the sound of weeping. I looked up, and Laura was sobbing. Her hands were over her mouth, and she was shaking her head back and forth. Coming back to myself, I yelled, "Call 911! Lizzie is dead too, and I can't clear her airway." Laura said in a hurried blast of words, "I've been trying this whole time, but the phones are not working. I even tried both our cell phones. It just rings and rings with no answer. Nothing is working." Tears were streaming down her face. "What's happening?" I don't know. I looked at her. How do I comfort her? I tried to keep the waver out of my voice as I answered her question. I wish I knew. Laura glanced at the neighbor's house. "Try their phone." I looked up at the neighbor's manufactured double-wide. It was neat with painted white trim, which seemed incongruous with the horror on the street. I jumped up. I could feel 1,000 needles in my legs as blood rushed back into my limbs. Despite the pain, I ran to the neighbors, leaped over their small white fence, and stopped at their open door. I paused for a second to brace myself for what I might see. I took a deep breath. As I entered, I could smell something akin to a mixture of vomit and blood wafting out of the house. I could see that the rest of Charles's family was dead too. They were sprawled out across the floor. Their little brown chihuahua, Tito, was licking up a pile of red foam in the middle of the carpet. Tito looked up at me questioningly, gave an obligatory bark, and went out of the room into the kitchen, making a little growling sound, nails clicking on the linoleum. Charles's wife, Susan, was face down on the floor. She was clutching the telephone in her pale hand. She wasn't moving. There was a trail of red foam on the floor, ending at her mouth. Her daughter was limply draped over the side of the couch, a trail of red foam streaming out of her mouth onto the floor. Her eyes stared into eternity. I went in. Tito had returned to licking up the red foam, so I yelled, "Get away from that!" He scurried down the hall. I tentatively took the phone from the woman's already cold hand, and in the process I almost slipped on the red foam on the kitchen floor. Of course, it was my bare foot. I wiped my foot on the carpet, trying not to think about where the red foam had come from. I raised the receiver to my ear. No dial tone. It made a rapping noise as I let it drop to the floor. I heard something in the bedroom and stepped over Susan's body and peered into a doorway. Carl, Charles's son, was sitting in a recliner facing a television, which seemed strange because Carl is blind. I think he liked listening to the news, but at this moment, there was merely static. The room was dark, and the television illuminated the walls with ghostly flickering. The back of the chair was angled toward me. I walked in and peeked around the chair. His eyes were dim, all life gone. There was red foam oozing out of his mouth down the front of his shirt. He was dead. They're all dead. His family is all dead. What's going on? I looked down in disgust as I noticed the foam smeared on my jeans and feet from trying to save little Lizzie. My shirt was covered as well. All I could think was, I have to get this stuff off me. I ran directly to the neighbor's garden hose, pulled off my jeans and my shirt, and rinsed off. Shivering, I walked over to Laura. She seemed to have snapped out of her initial shock, perhaps confused that I was now walking around in my underwear. I said, "Keep trying 911. His whole family is dead. The same foam stuff is coming out of their mouths. I need to get this stuff off me. It might be contagious." I must have been quite the sight, a grown man in his underwear, shivering, and limping around with only one shoe on. I kicked off the shoe before I entered the house. I went straight to the shower. I turned the faucet all the way to hot and ignored the pain as the streaming hot water poured over me. I furiously scrubbed my skin with a washcloth and soap. A few minutes later, Laura came in the bathroom. Before she could say anything, I asked, "Did you get through?" "No," she said quietly, with an unnerving quiver in her voice. As I toweled off and put on the underwear that Laura had brought down for me, she said, "You need to look at everything." She started crying and said, "It's happening all over the world. Everyone is dying." "Everyone is dying? All over the world?" Her words seemed to echo in my head. Time seemed to slow down. Laura was talking, but what she said didn't even register. She might as well have been talking to a statue. I was deep in my own thoughts, trying to make sense of what was happening. I didn't feel the chill from getting out of the hot shower. I didn't hear the children crying. I only heard the beating of my own heart as I tried to comprehend what this all meant. Then Isaiah, my oldest, knocked on the door, and I was shaken out of my shock. He said, "Faith has a dirty diaper, and the girls won't change her." He looked at me, perhaps wondering why I was half naked. Laura wiped away her tears, pointed to our homeschooling room, and said, "Go look at the computer." Then, as she walked out of the room, she said over her shoulder, "I'll change Faith and meet you in there." I quickly finished dressing into the clothes Laura brought me. I opened the bathroom door and noticed Laura had closed the curtains facing toward the neighbor's house. My twins, Eve and Eden, were standing in front of the curtains, trying to get enough courage to peek out at the bodies. I spoke softly to them. "You don't want those images stuck in your brain." They flinched upon hearing my voice and quickly moved away from the window. What images would be stuck in their brains in the future? What will the future bring? I walked into our home schoolroom and sat down at the computer. Laura already had a news website on the screen. There was report after report of a catastrophic infection or virus killing people all over the world. A couple days ago, we had begun to hear about some deadly flu outbreaks in parts of Europe, but it had seemed so distant. We didn't think it was anything to worry about. But now it has come to our own home, and now it is everywhere. Some of the first reports were from Asia. The virus had spread rapidly, and the disease centers were trying to quarantine the smaller infected countries. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't working. It just kept spreading. England was a dead zone. No one was allowed in or out. There were no more communications coming out of England and other parts of Europe. No one seemed to have any idea how this virus, or whatever it was, had spread so quickly and effectively. One news service said that China, Russia, the US, and the Middle East started having massive amounts of cases like last night. China already had over 2 million dead. The US also had well over 10 million dead and was rising quickly. Russia had deaths in the millions. The Middle Eastern countries had an estimated 500,000 dead also. Several terrorist groups were claiming responsibility. The news anchor said, "The only way this virus could be spread worldwide so quickly is if it is man-made and distributed around the world. It would need to have been a coordinated effort to release it all at once in different locations." Then he added, "We have no proof of this yet, but it is a likely scenario." The news reporter interviewed several people, and a large, bald white man said, "I think God got tired of us playing God and gave us this virus to kill us off." A little old black woman said, "I sure hope mankind survives this." There was another report about groups of protesters and rioters who had marched along the streets in Washington, D.C., causing trouble by breaking windows and spray painting graffiti along the walls of the buildings that they passed. The news anchor said, "That was the scene just 2 hours ago. This is the scene now." The camera panned along a street filled with bodies of the same protesters, with red foam trailing out of their mouths, onto their clothes, and onto the street and sidewalks. There were puddles of red foam everywhere, and there was one woman crawling along the sidewalk, clutching her throat as red foam spewed from her mouth. The view suddenly lurched sideways as the camera fell over and hit hard on the concrete. A crack had formed in the lens, and the camera skidded sideways and then rolled over, facing the cameraman himself. Even in the tilted view, one could see that his eyes were wide and panicked. He turned to run away from the scene that he had been filming. The scene switched back to the news anchor who was saying, Doug, are you there? Can you hear?" He was cut off by a view of the presidential seal of the United States. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I had just seen. The view of the presidential seal quickly switched to a view of the vice president. An announcer's voice broke in. "We interrupt this broadcast for a special message from the acting president, Madam Wilson. The former vice president had her swearing-in ceremony only moments ago as commander-in-chief. Madam President, you are live." I watched in confusion as Madam Wilson, the now acting president, stepped up to the microphone. What is going on? What happened to the president? She gave a short speech explaining that the president and his family had been killed by the plague that was sweeping the nation. She said that America would survive this. She prayed we would all remain strong. Then she declared a state of martial law, telling people to stay in their homes. Although she tried to hide it, I could see that she was not feeling well. I could see sweat on her forehead, and her armpits were soaked. She was clearly trying to stifle a cough as she spoke. She ended by saying, "God bless you all," and she signed off for the last time. The presidential seal remained on the screen for a long time. "Are we going to die, Daddy?" I heard behind me. I hadn't even noticed that my kids had come into the room. I looked back. Isaiah, my 11-year-old, was standing with my 10-year-old twins, Eve and Eden, and Abigail, my 8-year-old. They all had their eyes glued to the computer screen, and then they all looked at me with their puppy dog eyes. I wanted to promise them that I could protect them, but I thought, no, that might be a lie. I said, "I hope not." I grabbed Isaiah's chin and lifted it toward me. I looked him in the eye and then made sure the rest of the kids were looking at me, and I said, "I hope not. But if God wants us in heaven, then that's where we'll go. You kids need to go out of the room now, okay?" They filed out, and I heard a cough from one of the news anchors on the computer. I turned, and they showed footage of the one anchor woman who had contracted the virus. A commentator was saying that the symptoms began like that of a common cold. Within 45 minutes, the cold moved down into her lungs, and the coughing started. Then the scene cut to some video footage of the woman coughing spasmodically. "The coughing got progressively worse within another hour," continued the commentator, "and 30 minutes later, she passed out because she couldn't breathe." Then the footage showed disturbing images of the anchor waking up and gagging on red foam. There was a horrible gurgling noise. Her eyes were wide with terror as she clutched at her throat. "How can they be showing this?" The commentator said, "And then she basically drowned in that red foam. The total time lapsed 2 hours and 15 minutes before she succumbed to the disease." Then he solemnly looked into the camera and said, I have the symptoms as well." Then he coughed. I turned off the computer. I sat in shock. I know it sounds like a cliché, but I pinched myself to make sure I was really awake. Sadly, I was. What should we do? Where should we go? After a few minutes, I called all the kids and Laura to the dining room. I looked at my 7 beautiful children and wife and said, "Kids, go upstairs and pack your clothes. You need a week's worth. You older kids help the younger ones." Strangely, none of the kids complained. They all went upstairs and started to pack. Laura said, "I'll pack food and get our clothes." I said, "I'll get the camping stuff and pack the van." Laura eyed me questioningly. I said in response, "I don't know what to do here. I think we need to be prepared to go at a moment's notice." She nodded. I grabbed an old tarp out of the basement and covered the bodies of the neighbors in the street. I wasn't sure what else to do. Then I began loading up the van. Thankfully, we had a Ford van with capacity for 15 passengers to accommodate our large family. We were short a couple of seats in back because we typically kept them out for groceries and other storage. I loaded the bags of clothing, camping stuff, and food. When the kids were done, I told them to get into the van, and then I went to my gun safe. I knew that when things get crazy, people tend to get crazy too. I got out my Glock 9mm pistol, 44 Magnum 6-shooter pistol, and my hunting rifle, the Mosin Nagant 7.62 rifle. I put my holster on and slid the 9mm into place. The other 2 guns I placed in a case and grabbed a bag for the ammo. When I slid into the driver's seat and everyone was in the van, Laura looked at me. She asked, "Where are we going?" I put the van in reverse and said, "To the church. If we're going to die, then we are going to visit God's house first. Maybe we can go to confession and get our last rites."